All right. So I know Olivia has a lot to share with us. So I don't want to take away from any of her time. So hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Christina Grimm, the superintendent of Honouliuli National Historic Site. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the park and the camp, it was the largest and longest used incarceration site in the Hawaiian Islands during World War II. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, majority Japanese American citizens, but there were also German Americans and Italian Americans who were arrested and sent to Honouliuli throughout the duration of the war. But it also was a prisoner of war camp. It was a majority, actually, of a POW camp with over 4,000 POWs during the 3-year history of the camp. The majority of them were actually Koreans and Okinawans, conscripted forced laborers for the Japanese army, and of course the Axis countries of Italy and Japan, also POWs there. If you want to learn more, I actually did give a talk last month about the park and kind of what we're doing. So I'll put that in the links. So for folks, if you wanted to learn more about the history of the camp and the park and kind of the latest updates, you can enjoy that link later on as well. But I definitely wanted to jump straight into Olivia's talk. And why is it that we're having a person talking about Pueo when this is a POW and incarceration, a U.S. citizen incarceration site during World War II? Well, it's because we want to really highlight a lot of the other responsibilities we have at the park, which is also natural and cultural resources. We have some wonderful native species at the park, but one of the most prominent ones is probably the Pueo, which Olivia and I have been discussing is likely, definitely was likely around during that time period and likely very much seen by those held at Honouliuli. It's also actually the student from UH West Oahu. I know it's also the mascot and the logo for UH West Oahu here. And has a lot of interesting cultural significance that have ties to its role as a guardian, a comforter during times of war, which is very much tied into really the history of the camp as well. So we're really, really lucky to have Olivia be our virtual speaker for this evening because this month is dedicated to the native species of the park. We also have another talk on the native woolly woolly later this month as well, which is a tree actually found in the park. So this evening's guest is again Olivia Wang, and must thank our parks nonprofit, Pacific Historic Parks, for hosting this wonderful virtual speaker series to allow us to learn from Olivia and all our other wonderful speakers throughout the year about the park and the camp's history. So Olivia is currently a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She is working on migratory bird conservation and research in the Pacific Islands. She's originally from Southern California, and Olivia found her interest and passion for wildlife conservation while in college at the University of California, Davis. After she graduated, she worked on a variety of avian research projects throughout California, working with everything from tiny hummingbirds to hawks, and eventually found her way to the graduate program here at UH Manoa. There, she completed her master's research on Pueo, breeding and ecology. So, as you can see, we have a wonderful expert here tonight to share with us on Pueo. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Olivia.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you for that great introduction. Again, my name is Olivia. I'm currently a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If you are not familiar, we are a federal agency whose mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. That manifests in a lot of different ways. So if you've ever been to a national wildlife refuge, they're managed to protect species and their habitats, but also for public use so that you can visit them and go hiking in them and hunting in certain places. We make sure that laws that protect endangered species are being followed and help different entities comply with those regulations. And we also work a lot with partners that are open to enacting conservation actions to monitor and research wildlife so that we can understand how to keep species like the Pueo around for future generations. Um, so, Christine gave a great introduction about who I am, but I just wanted to tell you just a little bit more about how I ended up here. I grew up in a very suburban area where there was not a lot of wildlife, but there were a lot of um, crows, Canadian geese, house sparrows, and other little kind of common birds. But I always found them very interesting, but never really thought too much of it until I got to college and had my first exposure to the field of wildlife biology. I had some really great mentors that helped show me that a career path in this field was possible. And they also got me really, really into birding. Um, and then alongside that, for most of my life, Hawaii was never really on my radar as a place I necessarily like wanted to live. And I didn't know very much about it, but it just so happened that there was an opportunity to study Pueo at UH Manoa when I was looking for graduate school opportunities. And so I kind of ended up here unintentionally, but I learned so much about the ecology and the wildlife and the conservation issues out here, but also about the history of Hawaii, the culture, and the ongoing issues that both the people and the wildlife are facing here. So I feel very privileged to be able to live out here and to study all of these incredible species and just have the opportunity to play a small role in wildlife conservation in Hawaii. Um, so I am here. I work for the Migratory Birds Program. My job is just thinking about birds all day. But birds exist in a lot of different places and appear a lot in culture generally too. Real birds, mythological birds. They inspire a lot of poetry, art. They're in architecture, all sorts of places, and they symbolize a lot of different things to different people and different cultures. And so one of the forms of bird art that kind of ties into the Honouliuli National Historic Site and kind of why Christine wanted to bring me in to talk about some of the birds that might have been at the site during this 10th anniversary is the Japanese American bird pins. So there's this really great article on High Country News. You can Google this title, The Untold Story of Japanese American Bird Pins. But it goes into kind of the history of this craft and that has origins in Japanese American internment. Um, Christine already talked a little bit about this, so I won't go into detail, but basically, um, during internment, a lot of the folks in the camps were found different activities to engage in order to occupy their time. They taught each other different arts and crafts based on the skills that they knew. And one of the things that they worked on and created were these wooden bird carvings, and they would turn them into pins. And they were a very popular craft in the internment camps, not just at Honouliuli, but I think in all of them broadly across the nation. One of the reasons that they were really popular is that they didn't require a lot of materials to make. You can make them with scrap wood and scrap pieces of wire and metal that you found, and they didn't have much to work with. So this became a very popular um, thing that they made, and you can see that they're like very detailed and very well painted, and just yeah, you can tell kind of which species they are, like an Anna's hummingbird, a mallard. These aren't really species that you can see here in Hawaii, but um, yeah, they clearly put a lot of care into designing these bird pins. And it's kind of poignant that a lot of these incarcerated folks were recreating birds, maybe because they were just colorful wildlife that they could see around, but maybe also they symbolize some sort of freedom. Um, so birds have meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. They've always captured the interest and imagination of a lot of different people around the world. And Christine kind of alluded to this in the introduction, but one of the native species that the people interned specifically at Honouliuli that they may have seen would be the Pueo. But before I talk too much about Pueo, I need to give some context about the species as a whole. So Pueo are actually a subspecies of short-eared owl. Short-eared owls are found kind of all over the world, and in a lot of other places. They're known as a grassland and a small rodent specialist, so they are only found in grassland habitats. They eat primarily mice and voles and things like that. They exhibit nomadic movement patterns, which means that they don't stay in one place for a very long time. They move around a lot, following the food sources. Most of our understanding of short-eared owls broadly has been based on research in North America and Europe, and so the populations in North America are thought to be declining, and for that reason, they are listed as a bird of conservation concern by Fish and Wildlife. So I was saying they have a global distribution, and very few birds are like this, where you can kind of see them anywhere in the world. You can see they're basically on all continents except Australia, and they're also all of the arrows are pointing to specific island chains where you can find island-specific subspecies. The Pueo being one of them. Um, so again, a lot of the research on this species has taken place in North America and Europe, which has been very informative to learning about how we can better help the species. Um, but there hasn't been a lot of work done on the other populations. And so these regional studies can inform our understanding about how this one species has adapted to all these different environments and can now exist on all these different continents, including these like island chains. If you think about it, Hawaii is very different from Alaska, which is very different from Argentina. So how does this species exist in all these different places? Um, Regional studies are also necessary to ensure that local management actions reflect the local population's ecology. So a lot of the management actions that we had for Pueo here in Hawaii were based on research of their cousins in North America, which is helpful, but there might be some key differences in how they interact with different habitats or what they eat. This is all foreshadowing for what I'm going to talk about in a second. There might be some differences between these regional subspecies and what we know from their North American counterparts. Okay, so Pueo, the Hawaii subspecies that we have here, they are state listed as endangered, but only on the island of Oahu. They hold a lot of ecological significance. They're the only native owl species and one of only 3 raptor species across Hawaii entirely, the other one being the native Eo or Hawaiian hawk, and the other owl being the introduced barn owl that was introduced about 60 years ago, so relatively recently. And they also hold a lot of cultural significance. They're an amakua for many Native Hawaiians, which is if you don't know, an ancestral guardian, a family member to many people. So for many reasons, they're a very significant bird here in Hawaii. Um, but despite that significance, there's still a lot of things that we don't know specifically about them. Again, a lot of what we know, we just assumed based on what we know from the North American short-eared owls, and some of that might be helpful, but some of it might be different. There were a lot of questions about their population dynamics, so how their populations are doing, their habitat use, and also their breeding ecology. And so the goal of all of the research that I'm about to talk about was just to inform like some basic natural history work to better refine the conservation and management activities for the species out here in Hawaii. So all of the work that I'm going to talk about is stuff that took place based out of the Hawaii Wildlife Ecology Lab at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Um, there really had been no standardized studies on any aspect of Pueo ecology prior to about 2015-ish. That was kind of when the project got started. Wildlife managers were basing a lot of their recommendations off of information from North American short-eared owls. And so there was a lot of interest to better study the actual owls that we have here in the islands to better understand them. And so I was just one of many, many people working on various aspects of Pueo ecology. And so today I am going to try and summarize the main findings from a couple of different studies that we did, but this will not encompass all of the research that we have done on Pueo to date. But it will be a start. And again, I just want to acknowledge that I am one of many, many, many people that have contributed to this project. And so hopefully I do them justice as I summarize a lot of the work that they have done. And before diving into the more ecological side of things, I just wanted to highlight again their cultural significance. So one of the graduate students that overlapped at the same time as me, Calais Stormcrow, they translated and cataloged a huge database of indigenous knowledge that was recorded in Hawaiian language newspapers, which is one of the single largest sources of indigenous knowledge worldwide, and found, so they cataloged all of the information that was related to Pueo, all of the mo'olelo, or stories and histories that were encompassed in these newspapers as well, and um, basically found that they fit the criteria for a cultural keystone species, which is a species that has a significant impact on a culture or a group of people. It is often central to the identity of that group of people, and so like very important. And so Calais sort of has this really great thesis where they outlined all of these different like themes that appeared from how Pueo were mentioned in these different indigenous accounts. So it wasn't only like cultural like stories and histories, but also there were some of the ecological roles of Pueo that were captured in this indigenous knowledge information about how they interacted with different species. Um, it's really interesting. I don't have time to go super deep into it, but yeah. So the first aspect of sort of the more ecology side of things that I will talk about is the population dynamics. As a wildlife manager, you often want to know what is the population size of the species that you're concerned about, the population being all of the individuals of that species in a defined area. So how do you count every single Pueo in Hawaii? Um, you don't. You use some other method to estimate that because it's really hard to, how are you supposed to know that you've counted every single individual? Um, so we used a kind of a proxy for population. There's different ways to monitor population. Again, you could count all of the individuals in a given area, which would be a direct estimate. But the other method would be some sort of indirect estimate. So maybe how many relative individuals there are in a certain area. And one of the ways that you can make an indirect estimate is with occupancy models, which is detection at a given location. So the occupancy is the probability that a site is occupied by the species you're interested in. So if we take this grid right here and say that that is our study area or area of interest, and each box is a different site, someone goes and surveys at every single one of those little boxes and notes whether or not there's a Pueo at that site. And so let's say the yellow boxes are the ones with Pueo and the green boxes are the ones without. Then you go back the next year and you do surveys at all of those sites again and note whether or not there's an owl or Pueo there again. And then if you keep doing these surveys every year, you get an idea of how the occupancy rate or the relative number of individuals in this area is changing from year to year. This is a super oversimplification of occupancy models. There's a lot of other things that will inform this model, but basically this method is a little easier than trying to count every single individual Pueo. However, this method also means that you need surveys that occur in roughly the same sites over multiple years, which is a problem for a lot of projects that maybe don't have funding for a very long time, or if you're a graduate student that's only there for 2 years and you don't have an army of volunteers to help you survey all these places. So what one of the grad students in this lab, Chad Wilhite, did was he turned to a different community science program that is already existing. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's called eBird. This is basically a database and an app on your phone where you can, anyone can go in and go outside. If you see a bunch of birds, you can go into this app and you can log all of the birds that you saw at the site at a given time and date, and then you can submit it to this big database, and then someone like Chad can go through that database, pick out a species that they're interested in, and use it to inform an occupancy model. If you've ever played Pokemon, this is literally filling out your Pokedex. So I highly encourage you, if you're interested at all, to go check out eBird. And then your data could be used for something like this. So this is a figure from Chad's occupancy model study. This is a map showing the overall distribution of where Pueo were reported from across all of the main Hawaiian islands. So the blue dots are where Pueo were sighted. And the results of the occupancy study, we found that the overall occupancy rate was very low. However, it was very stable over the study period. He looked at data from 2010 to 2020 and found that the occupancy rate has been very stable over the past 10 years. So there has been no occupancy decline, which is good because there was thought that there might be a population decline here in Hawaii. But again, this is looking just at occupancy and not an overall count of individuals. So it tells us some things about the population and how the trends are changing, but it's still not quite the same as doing an actual population census and knowing how many birds are out there. Yes, so the conservation and management implications. Pueo occupancy is low across the state, but it's been stable over the past 10 years. And also, we found that the site turnover rate is low, suggesting that the Pueo occupy the same sites from year to year, and thus don't move around quite as much as the North American short-eared owls, which kind of makes sense in a way because we're in islands, they have a lot more restricted land area to work with, right, than a bird on North America. But yeah, but the next steps with this would be to assess population size and stability, but we would need some more surveys to do that. So the next sort of component of the study was, okay, so we know that Pueo occupancy is kind of stable over time, but now we're curious about how they use the habitats that they are in, and sort of like what kinds of terrain, what kinds of habitat qualities are they interested in and are necessary for them to survive. So one way to do that would be to track individual animals and see like you could watch it and see like what habitat is it in? Is it perched in a tree way up high in the forest, or is it sitting in a grassland somewhere? So how do you follow individual birds? So one way that scientists do this is by banding birds. This is a very common method used across a variety of species to mark individuals in the least sort of obstructive way possible, but still have the ability to identify them as individuals because you want to make sure you're not um, watching different individuals and making assumptions like, oh, they're all the same bird or something, right? So we have these metal bands that have a unique 9-digit code on them. And then we also have this colored band that usually has a 2 or 3-digit code on it that's a little easier to read from far away through binoculars. And you can attach these bands to the bird's leg. They kind of just sit like a bracelet and don't really interfere with their ability to move or anything. So that's how we can like recite them and see which individual it is. But another way to collect more specific data on them is putting transmitters on them. So a GPS transmitter that is attached to the bird. The way we attach them to the Pueo is we sew the transmitters onto little backpacks that we then put the backpacks on the birds. And again, this is a less intrusive way to try and study what the birds are doing and be able to collect sort of fine scale movement and habitat use data from them. So that is a transmitter sitting on that Pueo's back. These are just some more pictures of what some other data that we collect. Usually, if you're able to capture a bird and have it in hand, you go ahead and collect as much data as you can from them. So for us, this meant some morphometric data, so some measurements, and then also photos to document different plumages and things like that. So the results of that habitat use study were we were able to put transmitters on 9 Pueo, all were tagged on the island of Oahu. Each bird was tracked for an average of 100 days. It was kind of a big range. One of the transmitters, I think, fell off after 7 days, and then some lasted for about 200 days and stopped collecting data when the batteries for the transmitter died. So it's kind of a big range, but on average, it was about 100 days. And so from tracking these birds and their movements for 100 or so days, we found that Pueo were selecting forested and wooded areas for roosting during the day, but then they were hunting in grasslands and agricultural fields and urban areas as well during the night. So this is a map of the home ranges, or sort of the main areas of habitat use of two of the birds that were tagged. They were tagged out on the west side of Oahu, in Waianae. But to give you a better idea of like what these areas actually look like. So this is where we captured them, and also where most of them were spending a lot of their time was in habitats like this. So many like wide, empty grasslands, a lot of just like non-native grass, and then patches that you can see in the background of this like woody savanna and forest, a lot of kiave type shrubs. So that was like fairly typical. This is overall like fairly typical short-eared owl habitat. They like open areas, they like grasslands. But we also had some surprises. From one of those birds, it would leave the grassland area every night and then go over to this beach park. It would perch in the palm trees, on the buildings. It would hunt cockroaches in the beach bathrooms. Chad observed this, observed it hunting cockroaches directly. So that was pretty interesting, and I would say novel habitat use for a short-eared owl. Um, and then we also tagged one bird out on Kanayohe side, and this is just like the street, the Google Street View image I took from several of its locations, but it would just kind of perch at the street lines or the power poles, I think. This was like a repeat spot. It would just hang out over the street at night. So that is also very unusual for short-eared owls, and not really something that is documented over in North America. So this was very, very surprising to us. Um, and going back to what Christine said about Pueo, and whether or not they were they could have been seen from Honouliuli at any time. So this is a map that is showing sort of the south western side of Oahu. That yellow star again is Waianae area where we originally tagged the birds, and the blue and the white dots are locations of the Pueo. And I'm only showing two different individuals because I didn't want to put too many dots on the map, but you can see this blue individual spent a lot of time over in Waianae, and then there's a couple of dots where it ended up kind of closer to like Eva area, and this other bird with the white dots was also started out in Waianae side and then ended up spending a lot of time kind of in the Pearl Harbor area. And then this is just a closer zoom in of the same data. But you can see that yellow sort of polygon is the Honouliuli National Historic Site. And you can see that there are some locations from these Pueo that we tagged that are like very close to that area. They're using the agricultural fields that are in that part of sort of East Kapolei. This is another Google Street View photo that I took from one of those agricultural fields. I think there's also a skyline station somewhere near where these white dots are now too, so that's kind of interesting. But to go back to our sort of like original question, were Pueo in that area? I would say like definitely, most likely, yes. And they're still using this area. Um, I think this is surprising to a lot of people because Pueo are very hard to see, especially here on Oahu. But I think it's primarily because they're nocturnal. And people also don't know, I think, to look for them in these more like urbanized and developed areas. So this is just some suggestions to keep your eyes peeled if you're driving around at night. Look at the sides of the road. Be careful when you're driving because there might be some Pueo hanging out trying to hunt near you. Okay. And one last thing that was super interesting that came from our tracking study was, so all of the birds that we were able to tag, we put transmitters on them in Oahu, and one of our birds actually flew all the way to Molokai, which was pretty cool. We did not know prior to this. Well, we knew there have been like reports of Pueo seen while people are on boats transiting between islands, but this was the first time that this was confirmed with transmitter data on an actual bird. So this was super exciting to see. It flew all the way to Molokai. It spent, I think, a couple of nights there and then flew back to Oahu. So it took a little jaunt to a different island. And then the last thing that came from this tracking data was that, so because we were able to track these birds and know exactly where they were, we could also refine them again really easily. So we also looked at sort of their activity levels throughout the day and just confirmed that Pueo are most active during sunset and sunrise. And then during the evening, that is when they are doing most of their like calling, flying around, interacting with other Pueo and hunting for food. So some of the conservation and management implications of this. Pueo surveys should definitely include the crepuscular and nocturnal hours in order to overlap with the main periods of Pueo activity. They can sometimes appear during the day, but the crepuscular and nocturnal periods are definitely sort of their peak behavior times. The use of wooded areas was also kind of new. Again, a lot of the short-eared owls on the continent, they really only use open habitat. They're not really found in any forested or wooded areas at all, but the Pueo are, so we need to consider those areas as potential habitat for Pueo. We found a lot of urban habitat use, which was super, super cool. But this could also potentially mean that Pueo are at greater risk of urban threats, such as vehicle collisions, rodenticide exposure, if they're hanging out in a lot of agricultural places. And again, this was the first confirmation of inter-island movement with transmitter data. So we're all very excited about that. Sort of the last component of ecology that I'm going to be talking about is their breeding ecology, and this was what I personally worked on. And so birds in general and most wildlife, they're extra vulnerable during their breeding seasons because I mean, think about when people have kids, like you suddenly have another mouth to feed, you have a lot more responsibilities, you have to keep another thing alive. And that's the same with any species, right? So they're extra vulnerable, they're expending a lot of energy to try and suddenly feed all their babies. And the thing about short-eared owls is that they also nest on the ground. um, they don't they don't build nests in trees. They just lay their eggs kind of directly on the ground. So they are extra vulnerable to things like predators. Um, Rats, mongoose, cats, dogs will eat their eggs, their chicks, the adults. And they're especially vulnerable when they're sitting on the ground incubating eggs. And so one of the big management questions was when is the Pueo breeding season? So we need to know like kind of when is their like critical period that maybe we should be extra cautious about. And then also what are the important habitat characteristics for their nest sites? So are they selecting certain areas that are better for nesting for them? So I went out and I spent a lot of time walking around fields looking for Pueo nests. Um, Once I found a nest, I was interested in a couple different breeding parameters, clutch size, which was the number of eggs that they were laying, and also once I found a nest, like monitoring it throughout its entirety until the chicks were all grown, to get an idea of their nest success rates. I was also looking at chick dispersal distances. So short-eared owls are kind of unique in that the chicks, once they get to about 10 to 12 days old, they'll just walk away from the nest. And this is thought to actually be a predator avoidance technique in that if you have many chicks and then once they are able to, they sort of scatter. If they're all scattered all over the place, if the predator finds the nest, it might find one chick, but it won't find all of the chicks. So this is thought to be a survival technique. Um, the timing was trying to get better information on when the peak breeding season was a big one, along again with the habitat characteristics of the nest, because land managers are doing things like trying to mow grass for fire control or harvesting crops. And other sort of ground-based disturbances, but they want to know like when to try and limit those activities in order to minimize the probability of disturbing a Pueo nest. Um, so again, I was doing a lot of walking around in just these big open areas where I thought Pueo nests might be. In that leftmost picture, if you see that kind of like dark gap where in the grass, there's actually a Pueo sitting on its nest in that photo. It was very, very persistent. It did not want to leave until we were right on it. So they're very good moms. And then that rightmost picture is just an example of the visual obstruction reading pole that we use to sort of measure the different habitat characteristics at a nest site. And then in terms of what the nests actually look like, um, the leftmost picture here is at one of the grassland sites. And then that rightmost picture, there's actually chicks in that nest. And you can see when I say nest, I mean that term like kind of loosely. They basically just lay their eggs on the ground. They don't really have a very well-defined nest bowl or anything. And once the chicks hatch, they also just sit on the ground. And then after a couple of days, they'll start wandering away on foot. So the fact that they wander away on foot was also really fun and challenging because if finding the nest itself wasn't hard enough, in order to figure out how far the chicks were dispersing once they all left, I then had to go out and search for all of the chicks again. And they're pretty well camouflaged. These are two photos where there are Pueo chicks in them. I'll give you a second to see if you can see where they are. But yeah, so it was a lot of walking around very carefully, watching where you put your feet, making sure you didn't step on a little Pueo chick, um, and then marking where you found them. So the results from that, again, most of this work, all of this work was on Oahu. I was able to find a total of 13 nests. I found that the clutch size ranged between 1 and 7 eggs. So on average, they're probably laying about 5 eggs at each nest. And then after they lay those 5 eggs, the sort of maximum number of chicks that each nest would produce was also about 5. I also found that their dispersal distances were up to about almost 200 meters. So that was very important for a lot of the land managers to know because they wanted to know, okay, after, if we know where the nest is, that's good, but we know that they wander away. So we need to make sure we leave enough of a buffer distance for them. So that even after the chicks start wandering away from the nest, we know they're protected. So kind of figuring out what the maximum distances that these chicks were wandering off into was important. For the nest site selection stuff, I found that Pueo were selecting sites in grassland and wetland habitats with taller, denser vegetation than the surrounding areas, which makes sense if you're trying to avoid predators. You want a space with a lot of good cover so that you're a little bit more hidden, a little bit more protected. And I also found that nest success increases slightly at nests with greater vegetation cover, which again also makes sense. If you're more well conceived, your nest is probably less likely to get predated and therefore more successful. I'm gonna skip that last bullet point. In addition to this sort of like very focused data that I was collecting at the site, I also did a literature review and reached out to everyone that I know that works in wildlife conservation across the Hawaiian Islands to ask, hey, if you see a Pueo nest or a Pueo fledgling, can you please report it to me? And I'll try and collect some incidental data so that we can have a better idea of what is going on across the islands. So I was able to get some data from DOFA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and a couple different non-governmental organizations doing conservation work across the islands. And then this was super interesting because by spreading out and getting a lot of different groups reporting their data to me, I was able to get a better look at all of the different habitat types that Pueo could be breeding in. So again, this is where most of my work took place. It was in this like non-native dry grassland habitat. But then there were some different types of habitat like coastal shrubs. So this was actually out at Johnston Atoll. One of the nests, it's in, I think it's a naupaka bush, no, some other coastal shrub. And those pink chicks in the middle are the Pueo chicks. And all these fluffy white things around it are actually tropic bird chicks that are dead that the adult Pueo brought back as food for their babies. There's also a sooty tern wing that you can see there. So the Pueo out there, out at Johnston, it's a huge seabird colony, and so what they're eating is what's there, which is seabirds. So this was also really interesting to see. And I also got several reports of Pueo nests being found like way up Mauka in sort of the native wet forests in this like thick Eluhe understory. So it was really interesting to see and confirm that the Pueo can successfully breed in all of these different habitat types across Hawaii. So some of the conservation management implications from this, in grassland and wetland habitats, the Pueo are selecting for similar nest site characteristics, similar to what we see in shorter owls on the mainland, um, but they can also breed in a wide variety of different habitats out here in Hawaii. So any sort of conservation planning should account for all of the different habitat types that they can breed in. Um, and I think the next steps for this type of work would be to compare the nest site selection and survival and productivity across these different habitat types. So we know kind of what it is in the grasslands now, but maybe we could um, reproduce the study somewhere where it's wet native forest understory and look at how the nests there are doing and if they're as successful, more successful, or less successful. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I tried to cover a lot of our different studies. Um, Overall, I think our study suggests some key differences between Pueo and other short-eared owls. Pueo use forests and urban areas more. They're less nomadic, so they kind of stay in the same area, a little more consistency, and they can breed throughout the year in a variety of habitat types. There are definitely some like very important limitations to all of the work I just said. All of the studies, they had very small sample sizes, and we did all of the tracking and the breeding ecology stuff was mostly based on Oahu. And so we really would love to expand this work to other islands and be able to um, collect data from there as well. And also like thinking globally, like we need more information on other island populations of short-eared owls outside of sort of North America and Europe to sort of better understand how the entire short-eared owl population has evolved to live in these different areas. Kind of some next steps. There's some currently ongoing research from Molly Higman at the Bishop Museum, who's working on short-eared owl population genetics. And part of that will focus specifically on Pueo, and she has genetic samples from Pueo across all of the different islands. So she'll kind of be able to compare how similar the Oahu Pueo are to Hawaii Island Pueo or Maui Nui Pueo. So that will be really interesting, and I'm really excited for her work. I would say some other research needs are, again, like a statewide population estimate. We have the occupancy study, which was really informative, but we do need a sort of population number estimate. Personally, I think studying the interactions between Pueo, Eo, and barn owl, our three raptor species that we have here, would be really interesting. And going back to that one nest of that Pueo that was eating a bunch of seabirds, anecdotally, I've also gotten other reports of Pueo eating other seabirds, including threatened and endangered species. They'll also eat some of the endangered songbirds. And that's kind of cool in that like it's a native species interacting with other native species. But you know, it is a little worrying if some of those species are very, very endangered, very threatened, and we're working really hard to conserve each and every one of them. We want to better understand if Pueo predation is having a significant impact on these native and endangered species. It's not a complete list of future research ideas, but it is some of my personal goals. And yeah, that is all I have for you. I really appreciate you all showing up and listening to me talk about Pueo for 45 minutes. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, and my email is up there if you want to reach out. And yeah.
Well, that was great, Olivia. I didn't know that Pueo nested on the ground, and that there were Pueo all the way out at Johnston. Um, that's amazing. Uh, yeah, so personally have a lot of questions, but I want to respect the fact that other people on the call might have questions for you too. So yes, please feel free.
Oh, you're muted, Christine.
There we go. No, just encouraging folks to please, yes, ask questions of you, wonderful speaker, subject matter expert that we have tonight. You can either
Actually, Patrice, I think you had a question. If I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. Patrice, you still with us? Okay. I'm going to ask her question for Patrice. So she was asking, about the Pueo. Are they single moms or is the male involved? And are the chicks fed by the mother or are they able to eat on their own like chickens?
Great questions. They are not single moms. The mom does all of the incubating at the nest, but dad will bring her food while she's incubating, and they'll both kind of watch over the general area and keep predators at bay. I've seen Pueo dive bomb at cats, dogs that get too close. Um, it's kind of funny because Pueo really aren't that big, and they'll like be going after a cat that's twice its size. But yeah, so they are double parented. And then when they're very young, the parents will like feed their chicks. Um, but as they get older, they learn to eat on their own eventually. So they are not exactly like chickens that can kind of learn how to eat on their own as soon as they're fresh out the egg. They take a little bit of time to learn and need some help. I'm getting some direct chats with questions. I can read
Yeah,
those out.
yeah, if you want to ask them directly, I set it up so that they can chat with you directly.
Great. Stephen asks, how do you safely catch them to tag them? I wish I had a photo of this because it's kind of cool. So the main way that we caught a lot of the Pueo here is with this trap called a balshatri. It has origins in like Middle Eastern falconry, where they were trying to catch a lot of falcons for falconry purposes. But anyways, it's basically this metal cage, and the cage has a bunch of strings on the top of them that sort of like cinch up when something is stuck in the string. And inside the cage, you put a live mouse, and and then you put that whole trap on the ground. And so the mouse is in there in this cage. It's running around doing mouse things. And you put that on the ground, and a Pueo is flying over. It's hunting. It's looking for food. It sees movement on the ground, or it hears the mouse squeaking, making noises, and it'll hone in on that and then land on top of the trap and get its feet stuck in the cage or in the strings on top of the cage. And the cage is also like pretty heavy, so the bird cannot fly away when its feet are stuck in the trap. And the entire time that the trap is out, I or some other biologist researcher is sitting a couple 100 feet away, watching from a truck or a blind hidden. So we are watching the trap the whole time. So as soon as we see that the Pueo is stuck in the trap, we can run out and go remove it from the trap. It usually just takes like a minute or two for us with our fingers. It's very easy to undo the strings. Um, and then we have the bird in hand, and then we can pretty quickly collect all of that data and attach the transmitter to it, and then send it out back into the wild. There's other ways to trap them, but that was sort of the main one that worked for Pueo for this project. Antonia asks, when the chicks disperse after 10 days, do the parents call to them to find them to feed each one? Yes, they do. So that was also kind of another way that I would try and figure out where the chicks were, was I would sit and sort of watch the general area where I knew the nest was, and then sometime like very I think maybe only once or twice I actually saw a parent go to where the chick was after it had dispersed from the nest, but you could also hear them calling back and forth to each other. So yes, once the chicks disperse, the parents will then find each one individually and check up on it, feed it, um, and do those things. Robin asks, how old are chicks when they begin to fly? Great question. I should have mentioned this. They are typically around 28 days old when they're first able to fly. And then even then, they're pretty awkward for a little bit. So it's probably at least like a full month before they're like fully adult, able to fly level. And so they disperse from the nest at about 10 days old. And so from 10 days old to 28 days old, they're sort of just walking around the area, trying to hide from predators, getting fed by the parents. Um, yeah. Krista from Kauai National Wildlife Refuge, hi, asked, why do we claim that they are a diurnal owl species? We do observe them during midday in flight at the refuge. Yes, I think there's, it's not a misconception because they definitely do go out and hunt sometimes during the day. But really what we found from like the tracking studies is that they do that sometimes, but their primary like activity time is still during the crepuscular periods and at night. And so I don't think it's like a wrong claim necessarily. I think it's just because it's such a novelty to see an owl out during the daytime that we're like, oh, they're like a daytime species. And it's like kind of true, but they are still like very much nocturnal as well. Laura asks, how long lived are Pueo? I actually don't know the answer to that. I would guess in the wild, generally, raptors in the wild live around like 10 years. Um, I think if they're in captivity, so like at peak health and are being fed the most optimal diet, like a lot of raptors can live like 20, 30 years at maximum. But I would say like in the wild generally, um, 10 years is about average. That's all the questions I have on my end.
So I have a couple questions. So I might have missed this, but do we know what the success rate for fledglings are out of the clutch?
That was a great question. And I do know that, but I don't, or like I did look at that, but embarrassingly enough, I don't know it off the top of my head. Um,
So I'll ask my
I,
second question.
I'm trying to think. Um, the success rate is low. I can
Oh.
say that much. I can pull up actual numbers for you later.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just curious how many made it to
No, yeah.
adulthood. But the second question is just really basic. So you could have chosen to study any bird, you know, why
hmm
Pueo?
Um, well, for me personally, I sort of got my start in undergrad studying northern harriers, which are a species that you can that they aren't, well, sometimes one or two will show up here in the islands every winter. But basically they are another raptor species common on the continent. And they're a hawk, but they're very owl-like. Like they have sort of a rounded face. They hunt with their hearing as well. They live in very similar habitats as short-eared owls. Um, in sort of like open grassland, open marshy areas. Um, and kind of like my mentor in undergrad who got me hooked on birds and showed me that wildlife biology was a thing. That was her PhD project. And so I helped her out with that and spent a lot of time looking for harrier nests out in the San Francisco Bay Area. It ended up being very similar and prepared me very well for searching for Pueo nests. And then after that, I did more raptor focused research at a raptor migration site out on the West Coast. And so I had a lot of raptor experience. And so when I was looking for grad school, I was thinking that it would be cool to be able to continue that. Um, and then I, when I learned about the UH lab that was working on this, um, I was like, oh, that's cool. And it seems like they really like there hasn't been a lot of research done on them. So there's a lot of potential things that I could study with these species. And so that was sort of like the extent of my knowledge about them coming out here. And then, but yeah, it was just really cool to learn how different the Puyo are from their North American counterparts, and then also how like special they are to a lot of the people here. I know someone in the chat mentioned like Puyo is their Amakua. One of the land managers that we worked with at one of these sites, Puyo was also their Amakua, and they were like super excited about the work that we were doing, and it was great to just like talk story with him and learn about his experience with the Pueo. And so that was all just very special. And I'm wearing a Pueo shirt. They forever have a special place in my heart and home because people keep gifting me Pueo themed things.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your mana'o with us tonight on this very, very special bird. We will, for those of you who have friends that couldn't make it and want to share the talk further, it will be posted on our website later as well. So check back there if you want to link to this recording. And I'll just close out by sharing kind of the rest of our May events for the month that you might be interested in. So this Saturday, we're going to do a special tour of the Komkom Mission, which is where their founding priestess, Shinto mission, Haruko Takahashi, was held at Honouliuli. So they're doing a special tour to commemorate the 10th and partner with us on talking about her. They'll have some of her memorabilia and photos as well. And we're also going to have continuing the theme of native species for the month. We're having a table event at Patagonia at their Honolulu store, joined by, again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a person from the James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. Olivia talked about that. And then also Kalaleo Heritage Park as well for the cultural resources in the Ahupua'a. So drop by from 10 to 2 at Patagonia. And then we are also going to have another virtual speaker later this month talking about our rare lowland dry land forest tree, the Willy Willy. And so that will be on, let's see, it's on the link that I sent you. But that's going to be on May 28th at 5 p.m. And again, register for that link as well. A lot of very similar cultural significance as well, but that is a tree species that we do have at the park as well. And then our last event is tied to Memorial Day weekend, where we're going to have author Gail Okawa talk about her personal family history for incarceration and talking about the Nisei veterans that served during World War II, and we'll also have a book signing with her on the 24th. So all the details are on the link on the website for some of their other May events. But I definitely want to thank everybody for joining us on this lovely Wednesday evening and taking your time to learn about our very special Pueo at the park and in the Ahupua'a. And definitely want to thank Olivia for sharing her wonderful knowledge with us. And look forward to continuing to partner with you on maybe future work at the park related to Pueo. And again, thanks to Pacific Historic Parks and Wes, who you heard behind the scenes helping us with this virtual speaker event tonight as well. So again, mahalo to everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in some future anniversary events this year. Thanks very much. Have a good night.